Some of the harsh realities of crossing the border, because that comes up as far as like what is it actually like, is kind of a story of coyotes and abandonment. So just quickly, coyotes, just so you know, are people who smuggle other people across the border. This can be anybody who's it can be somebody smuggling Russians across the border. Our border doesn't just have to be just Mexicans, except for our theme it is. But there's also Latin Americans, Russians, people from all different backgrounds and ethnicities and countries coming across the border to the United States because of the so-called amazing opportunities and cities of gold that we have. So oftentimes coyotes will use the promise of a job, which this just subtitles or kind of comes out as slavery, and whether that's sex trafficking or forced labor for several years, which is really horrible, but is actually also a way that our economy has, what our economy has based itself on, which is really terrible and something that we need to be definitely aware of and looking at. So an example of a really harsh border crossing was the Yuma 14. This is a group that tried to cross the Devil's Highway, and there are different accounts depending on who you talk to as far as the survivors. Some say that there were 30, there were 26, there were 24. Accounts kind of vary because once people get lost in the desert and they've been there for several hours, the sun kind of bakes anything that would be identifiable as far as the sun can bake with, it'll make their skin so leathery that they won't have any fingerprints, and so thus no way to identify them, because most illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants don't bring very much with them because they've paid so much for the trip across. This specific group, however, was abandoned in the middle of the Devil's Highway by a coyote. Kind of unclear why, but only 14 of them survived, and originally there were 15, but one died en route to a hospital. So the Border Patrol picked them up and took them to the hospital, and yeah, and it's very interesting because the book talks about how these people never end up having a home. They're kind of they're in this horrible place of just limbo as far as not having a country to call their own, not Mexico, not the United States. Nobody wants them until they're dead, and then everybody wants to claim them. As far as the Yuma 14, like this whole huge news piece was done on them, and everybody wants to say that they were the ones to find them, versus realizing what the true problem is with how harsh it is to cross the border. So another theme of his book is displacement and separation of families, and how immigration and immigration laws, especially those in recent presidential years by President Trump, have separated families and have separated cultures and do nothing but harm to both sides of that. So border security and immigration enforcement improvements is one of the laws that has gone into act recently, signed by President Trump in January, which in this thing permits the detention of non-legal citizens in the United States, thus increasing the chances of separating families under, and this would be in the Center, you can find this information in the Center for Immigration Studies of New York, so specifically New York. So just continued separation, continued loss of identity, continued loss of loved ones, from everywhere. So, and that's what Luis Urrea's book, The Devil's Highway, which is that stretch of land that's just desert, no water, one of the biggest stretches of desert in the United States, is about, is this harsh reality that is somewhat appealing to migrants because of how poor the conditions are in Mexico and how good life seems to be in the United States. So huge numbers crossing the